David, how are you? Welcome to a slightly later start than our usual show. How's everything?
I'm very well, thank you, Jason. It's going to be an exciting show today.
Yeah, there's all kinds of new topics and information, patents that you've come up with. What have you got for us today?
Well, broad brush, as you know, 911 was a pivotal event in America's history. And of course, a lot of people have pointed at this long bearded wanderer straddling a yak in a cave in Afghanistan. But
Hmm.
obviously, he had none of the resources necessary to bring a country like the United States of America to its knees. So I've been delving into, as you know, with you, into the patent office to see if we can find technologies where the DNA, if you will, goes back even to the Second World War, like the proximity fuse, that if it fell into the right hands and people with custody of those patented devices had the right kind of skills, they could synchronize the patents and wage an attack on 911, of the attack of 911, and attribute it to Osama bin Laden, when in fact it was a deep and profound conspiracy that stretches into, and here's, I think, the punchline, the university faculty, the prison system in the United States and the Five Eyes countries, and basically the Ministry of Defense and various intelligence agencies that have been corrupted in both countries over the years. Over to you.
Well, it's interesting, David, because I think we've probably got a lot of new viewers with us. The subscribership for Crowdsource the Truth is growing all the time, and I'm not sure that everybody who's watching us right now is necessarily immediately familiar with your process of going to the patent office. And for some people, it sounds quite bizarre. I definitely would encourage our new subscribers to be checking out David Hawkins' Reverse CSI on Fridays. People can see it on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, and also patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, as well as subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. But David, you've told me now for over a year how important the patent office has been to the British Empire, and basically it's the control of high technology and utilizing that technology to essentially control the world, communications, timing, various radar technologies like the cavity magnetron. It seems that there are certain key technologies that are seen as imperative, necessary for dominating, and the people in power have a way of controlling them through the patent office. Isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go back to 1811, Dr. William Thornton, the first superintendent of the American Patent Office, and incidentally the designer or architect of the Capitol building, he was approached by a guy who'd invented a rifle and asked if he would issue a patent for the rifle. I think the guy's name was Hall or whatever. He was quite an interesting figure in early American industrial history in the 19th century. Anyway, Thornton, who was Anglo-American, said that he would grant the man a patent if he put his, that is Thornton's name, on the patent, right? So there you have. Now, is it Anglo-American corruption? I don't know, but it does show that the British Empire, if you will, was paid a great deal of attention to any new and useful ideas, some of these ideas were patented and obviously spread great benefits, vaccination technologies, etc. But others were weapons of war, and very important weapons of war. And when the British, and I'm making a claim here, I think the British burnt down the American Patent Office in around 1836 after taking the first 10,000 models, trademarks, specifications invented by Americans over to the United Kingdom to turbocharge the Industrial Revolution, if you will. And anyway, the Patent Office continued to this day. And now we have the man that you interviewed, a most telling interview about, a couple of months ago, who
Yeah.
became Commerce Secretary under the Trump administration, 25 years with N.M. Rothschild and Sons, which is the investment banker for Serco, the company that we keep talking about, Queen Elizabeth II, and United States President Donald Trump. who went through a fundamental debt restructuring process in the 1990s, if you will, waged or organized or structured by Wilbur Ross. So Wilbur Ross knows where all of the sovereign debt skeletons are buried, if you will. And I think maybe you could perhaps remind listeners of the gist of the interview. It was a rather short one, but it was very pithy, I think is the word. Over to you.
Well, Wilbur Ross told me that the patent office runs itself. I asked him if he could speak with us briefly about Serco's influence over the patent office, and he just simply said it's a government agency that runs itself. I know, David, you and I doubt that that's a completely true statement, but Wilbur Ross didn't seem terribly interested in speaking to me. People can go back into the archives of Crowdsource the Truth and take a look at that interview with Wilbur Ross, but we've got him pictured in today's photo collage sitting right in front of the U.S. Patent Office. He's also spoken about how during his tenure as Commerce Secretary, the 10 millionth patent was granted, right?
And the 4 millionth patent application was processed by Serco.
Yeah.
So Serco announced on the 15th of November of last year that it had processed 4 million patents for the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and the 10 millionth patent of which Mr. Trump and Ross, or President Trump and Ross, were so proud, was very interesting because that was a patent granted to Raytheon for constructing three-dimensional images from laser scanning from a satellite. And the particular example they gave, I don't know if you've got that to your hand in your archives, I thought was very telling, because I think what they're essentially selling or telling Americans, who I think they treat as ignorant peasants, and of course we have to balance the scales there and make sure that they understand that when America wakes up, the giant will take revenge. But anyway, the particular patent, or the image shown for the Raytheon patent, was the ground zero carnage or destruction associated with the demolition of Towers 1 and 2 and building number 7. And you can see on that particular three-dimensional image structured by Raytheon that building number 7 is behind a wall of buildings that are relatively untouched. And the problem is building number 7 came down in the same way as building 1 and 2, even though it was never hit by a plane. But I digress. So, if we go back to the collage, let's get a big picture here. Essentially, over on the left, we have a picture. It might be the strontium clock at the National Physical Laboratory, as opposed to the cesium clock. But the British in 1954 at the National Physical Laboratory invented the clock that is basically the cornerstone for GPS timing and precision navigation of aircraft. It's been refined and the technology has been improved. Now I think it's accurate to within 1 second in 168 million years, which should see you and me out, right? But it's a very, very effective clock. And what these turkeys have done is they've effectively outsourced the American Patent Office to the British company Serco, for the which the Vice President of Intelligence Services is one Maureen Baginski, right? Who's wearing that, I don't know how to pronounce the word, but it's actually a Phrygian, Phrygian hat of the kind that was worn by the people known as the sans-culottes. That is, sans-culottes, the people without trousers, who were party to the carnage of the French Revolution, where they took aristocrats, yes, but some of the best brains in France, and chopped their heads off. And this was a public ceremony, and a whole bunch of people from the poorest quarters of Paris, and this was, I think, to the everlasting shame of the French, which is an extraordinary country with great refinement and skills and knowledge, but they turned on the most talented, or the most educated, let's say, with many, many social wrongs that are not rectified by chopping people's heads off. Anyway, those hats would be typical of what was worn when the public ceremonies were, the public were rolled up to watch the heads falling into the basket and being carried away, by the peasants, I guess. So Maureen Baginski is a very interesting character because I think for 25 years she had a very senior position in the National Security Agency. One of the NSA's agency centers is Fort Meade in the United States, where one Russell Williams used to visit on a regular basis. He had top security.
Right.
Gareth Williams, I'm sorry. Yeah. And he ends up in a bag. But anyway, back to the skyscrapers at the top. Over her Phrygian hat, if that's the right pronunciation, is an AWACS aircraft. And going back to the idea of using patents as weapons, there is a patent for the interactive training of AWACS weapons directors. And if you look at the schematic for that, you'll see that this system can be used for courseware, i.e. one-on-one training of an AWACS weapons director, through simulation to live fire. And if you had access to the timing signals that drive the AWACS aircraft, and you could substitute, instead of GPS signals, precise signals coming over fiber, you could literally hijack the AWACS aircraft flying on 911 and switch them from a simulated continuity of government exercise to live fire events of the type that we saw on 911. And the pilot of the plane, quite possibly, would not recognize that there'd been a friend or foe switch or friend to foe switch, and fail to understand exactly what happened on 911, when in fact, if they did a little patent historical analysis, they would find that the friend or foe identification patent was originally granted to Ferranti in the United Kingdom, I think in the 1940s. And subsequently, some decades later, there is a friend or foe patent that has been granted to the American Jerome Lemelson. And of course, effectively what we've done is now the British have infiltrated the American Patent Office using precise timing signals from the strontium or cesium clock at the National Physical Laboratory. So I would say Mr. Ross is actually either negligent, reckless, willful, or fraudulent in failing to understand how vulnerable, and that's a word I think Mr. Swigart understands, how vulnerable the Patent Office is to a hacker, a skilled hacker, of which Mr. Swigart, who you and I have discussed at great length, is apparently very skilled. He even has written a book, Ethical Hacking.
Yeah.
And you put him in the costume. Could you just go over that costume a little bit? And
well, I understood that he wanted. Yeah, I understood that he wanted to be depicted as a flamenco dancer, which I previously thought only women could be flamenco dancers. We had shown him in a red pimp outfit last week because he's the subject of various political cartoons. He's a limited purpose public figure, having thrust himself into this public discourse and creating daily commentary in social media. So as a public figure, he is subject to criticism, and we use political cartoons, photorealistic cartoon collages like this to do that type of commentary. And Mr. Swigart commented that he thought he would look good as a flamenco dancer. At least I thought that's what I understood. So here he is as a flamenco dancer in his red outfit. He has designated himself the red team leader. And David, there's a little bit of background I think we want to fill in, perhaps some of our new viewers. There's a number of different topics that you've introduced in today's show, not the least of which is, of course, the timestamps, Of course, we've been speaking about split tunneling, and it seems even more important than ever now that Bill Binney has come out recently with a new statement regarding some of the evidence of this alleged Guccifer 2.0 information, where he said he had two streams of data that when combined form one stream of data. So that seems very much like the split tunneling patent that you've spoken about. Give us a little background on the split tunneling.
Okay, yeah, sure, absolutely. So there is a patent relating to, I think, time division multiplexing and split tunneling, where you can take data, let's say hypothetically crime scene data. Crime scene data and evidence is supposed to have a chain of custody from the time it is collected at the crime scene, such as those folks outside the Pentagon picking up evidence from the Pentagon lawn. What they're supposed to have done, as I understand it, is you timestamp and location stamp a piece of evidence, drop it in a plastic bag, and it's signed off and then logged. And it has to get all the way into, let's say, the FBI laboratory, which unfortunately has the reputation of being a tainted laboratory for various reasons. So it stays in the custody of people right through to the professional or forensic crime scene investigators, so that when it comes to court, the prosecuting lawyer or the defending lawyer can be certain that the evidence presented in court has not been tampered with. All right, there you see a classic example. Some guy in an FBI t-shirt has picked up a piece of evidence from the Pentagon lawn, and I would argue he's committing a felony, right? There is no indication for me that that piece of evidence has been put into a chain of custody before reaching ultimately the FBI, who should have been analyzing the crime scene. And unfortunately, we've confused terms because we call it now, or it is called a terrorist scene. It's not a terrorist scene, it's a crime scene, right? The same laws apply. And when the FBI go in and pick up evidence, what always intrigues me is who's telling them to go in there. Has a communication system been hacked so that effectively you've got a three-tier or a three-tunnel data flows? That is to say, all of the evidence that should be data stamped and location stamped and protected is being taken and given to an insider group who can profit from the 9/11 attack, which I allege to be the teachers or faculty associated with the evil electronic visualization laboratory at the University of Chicago, Illinois in Chicago, which is in the business, as I understand it, of time stamping large data sets from around the world in the interests of research.
Now, David, if I may add, for people who are just tuning in, it's not you and I who have designated the electronic visualization lab at the University of Illinois in Chicago as EVL. That's their own acronym for the EVL, the Electronic Visualization Lab. And I guess they thought it was clever and funny to call it that. You and I have pointed out the sort of ironic double entendre of a university that would employ Bill Ayers, basically an unindicted domestic terrorist. They've got him on faculty, or they did for many years, and they also happen to have this EVL lab. People who have seen our previous shows or are familiar with the Weather Underground will know that Ayers' wife, Bernadine Dorn, in the 1970s issued a radio address where she warned Americans to protect the universities, protect the banks, and to protect the airplanes. And you and I have been pointing out for several weeks now remarkable coincidences between the targets of the Weather Underground and the targets that were taken out on September 11th, and ways in which patented technologies could be exploited to plan and execute 9/11 through this EVL lab, computer lab there in Chicago.
Well, that's right. So Electronic Visualization Laboratory, the acronym is EVL, and that's very convenient from our point of view because it sounds like evil. If the cap fits, wear it, right?
Right.
And Bernadine Dawn is evil. I mean, she's a psychopath. Yeah. She gives seminars on torture paradigms and practice, right? Or she did at the Northwestern University in Illinois. And the intriguing thing about tracking the DNA of various patents. For example, Northwestern University has been granted a patent for a detoxification system by, I think, funded by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And if you Google for that, you'll find that Novichok is one of the agents, the nerve agent, that is being detoxified. And I'm assuming you can't prove that a detoxification system works unless you have samples of what is to be detoxified. And the extraordinary story of the Bishop Larry Gators at the Global Spiritual Revolutionary Radio, who was interviewing me on a monthly basis. And then he dropped away in February. Unbeknown to me, I thought he was just moving on. But he had the courage to look seriously at the Down Low Club in Chicago, which, as I understand it, is a club where ugly women, and I don't mean physically ugly, but spiritually or whatever ugly, who can't find a husband, are paired up with young gay black men to create a family, or something that looks like a family, with a beard. That is to say, it looks like a conventional family, and adopting a couple of children, suddenly you've got, potentially, I would say, a family that might one day end up in the White House.
You know, now, David, I don't know if I've told you this, but I originally heard of the Down Low Club because Dr. Corsi had done some investigative reporting on that. And of course, Dr. Corsi, as most people know, was one of the targets of Robert Mueller's recent investigation. He's also been a target of some of the same social engineers that seem to want to constantly badger you and I. So it's interesting how, you know, these things come together. Today's the first time really that we've discussed Bishop Gators on the show, and his story is remarkable. You've been sharing it with me. Let's go over that a little bit, shall we, David? The bishop was poisoned?
Yeah, sure. So apparently Bishop Larry Gators, went to a Queens restaurant, a Spanish restaurant in Queens, which is very popular and normally full. He made a reservation, but of course he has a talk show which relates or includes a critique, if you will, or an analysis of the Down Low Club, which reflects quite unfavorably on Barack Hussein Obama and his wife, originally Michelle LaVaughn Robinson. Anyway, in the restaurant, as I understand it, and I think we'll be having an opportunity to talk with Bishop Gators, and I think that will be beyond fascinating. He went for the first time to this restaurant. He was told, and again, this is all secondhand, so I may have misinterpreted it totally or partially. He was told he wasn't welcome because of his criticism of illegal immigration and Barack Obama. Anyway, welcome or not, he went back a second time, I think on the 1st of February, to the same restaurant. He waited an hour and a half to be fed. The restaurant was basically deserted, or I think there were 5 people in it, he said, and normally it was very full, which I find curious. And the following day, he was rushed to hospital, a very, very sick man, vomiting blood, evil-smelling odor. He got edema, liver and kidney damage, got 2 bouts of the wrong medication. Again, this is what he's told me. And I asked him the other day what the poisons were, because he believes, and his doctors believe, that he was poisoned. And they said that, or he said, that they found thallium and arsenic and rat feces in his blood. Now, thallium is very interesting because, again, the moment I saw that, I have some experience with isotopes of thallium iodide. It's used for scintillation detectors in the oil industry and other industries, etc. I did some research into any patents that were relevant to rat poison, heavy metals like thallium and arsenic, and I found out that a patent had been granted to the American University of Puerto Rico for the remediation of heavy metal poisoning, which I found interesting. And as far as rat poison is concerned, I don't know if you've ever heard of warfarin. I've been treated for warfarin because I had, after a tour in Nigeria, I had Entamoeba histolytica, I think, which are nasty little creatures that swim around in the fluid of your eye.
Ooh,
They give me some rat poison. I seem to remember it was called warfarin. But
wow.
warfarin, I didn't know. The word WARF is an acronym of the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation,
Hmm.
which variously has been described as a patent troll, and a very aggressive patent troll. This is where a university actually acquires a patent for a system, probably invented or developed by faculty, and then has the possibility of sharing a percentage of the royalties or the revenues attracted by that patent amongst faculty, which is intriguing because I don't know if you remember the Unabomber.
Yeah.
There's a whole theory that the Unabomber suspect, Ted Kaczynski, who's ended up in ADX Florence, courtesy of Christine Marcy, Phil McConnell's sister, that he in fact was not responsible. He may have written a manifesto, but the patents or patented devices or systems used in the Unabomber attack have been attributed to a guy called Ray Detling, who wore I don't know, he wore a mink coat. He was a pretty eccentric, loud-mouthed, obnoxious prick, if that's the right word. But anyway, apparently it's a very effective method of laundering money used in murder for hire is to run it through the opaque accounting systems of the patent office. So when Mr. Ross pretends not to know that the United States Patent and Trademark Office has been outsourced to Serco, what he may not be aware of, or maybe he chooses not to declare it, is there's potential for Serco to launder money through the patent office for events that result in, I don't know, mass casualties, and let's say hypothetically a reduction in the carbon footprint of people who otherwise got in a plane and hope to arrive at the other end intact. So that's why I think in this collage we've identified or associated Wilbur Ross, given his background with N.M. Rothschild, with the financial intelligence network that I believe was referred to by Osama bin Laden. And I don't know if someone can help us find this, but shortly after 9/11, I went to the dentist. You can see from my teeth that that's a regular event for me. And there, a Time magazine quoted an interview with Osama bin Laden a few months after the 9/11 attack, where he said, "We have three independent networks to move our assets around the world, and all the resources of the British and the Americans cannot stop us." Well, that piqued my interest because, let's say, I'm of average intelligence. I'm a Brit. I'm now a Canadian citizen. You're an American. I find that quite a challenge for a man allegedly responsible for the 9/11 attack. Obviously, he was part of a much bigger system, to say that we can't stop these networks being engaged to, well, had 9/11 succeeded, overthrow the government of the United States. So we have a financial network, I believe, led by Wilbur Ross. And then over to the left on your collage, we have this central figure whose name is Cass Sunstein,
Yeah.
who is, I believe, a 27-year veteran on faculty at the University of Chicago, where Obama taught. And he's written some interesting books or papers. One being, I think, Conspiracies and Other Dangerous Theories. And he's laid out a program whereby the government can protect itself against, quote, conspiracy theories which threaten government anti-terrorist programs. But you see, from a logical point of view, you're in a vicious circle, particularly when you've got ethical hackers playing around in the fringes, like this guy Swigart doing his dance to Zulu time, because I think you and I have puzzled over what is the role or moral responsibility of an ethical hacker. If he's wearing a white hat, in this case, you've got him wearing a black hat. If he's wearing a white hat, he's allegedly invited in by a client to test for vulnerabilities in the network. And we know that Swigart has worked with or for Booz Allen and Hamilton and the United States Army and the National Security Agency. In what role, I don't know, but certainly working with classified networks, presumably in good faith, NSA hired the guy to do some vulnerability testing, in which case he would have been or should have been wearing a white hat. But what happens if through negligence, recklessness, willfulness, or fraud, he neglects to do his homework and study the possibility of a GPS timing system being switched to the National Physical Laboratory timing system in the middle of a continuity of government exercise, so that actually you can take a Boeing AWACS aircraft and switch it from a simulation to live fire? I don't think this man has the brains or the background to change hats in midstream. I think he would go in thinking he was a white hat, but much smarter people than him, in fact, I believe in the GCHQ in the United Kingdom and the National Physical Laboratory, say, put him on the payroll with, let's say, Maureen Baginski, open up the network to what appears to be ostensibly a white hat vulnerability test, and in the middle of that test, switch to live fire and take America down to its knees. Over to you.
Well, David, let's talk for a minute about the importance of time stamping, because it's come up. And the thing that's really interesting is that, you and I are not setting out to speak about this guy. He just keeps coming back at us. You told me about the Federal Bridge. Certainly you never heard of David Swigert before he started making videos about you. Same thing with me. I didn't know who the guy was. He, I guess, doesn't like our show, so he's constantly criticizing it, accusing you and I of doing all kinds of outlandish things that he has no evidence to prove. But he's been involved, as we've come to know him through his taunting videos, he's been involved in some companies in Luxembourg. There was something going on with NATO generals that his brother talks about that makes him crazy. But there's this company, eTimestamp, that we've just included as not an accusation of them doing anything, but anytime someone or some entity comes into the story, we sort of put it into the photo collage, and these collages have essentially become, storyboard is not the accurate word, but they are photos that sort of tell a story of their own. So how is this eTimestamp part of the story?
Well, Swigert, when he was working in Luxembourg, I believe was responsible, I forget the name of the company he's working with.
Eurosign card?
Eurosign? Okay. He introduced the idea that since that company was engaged in facilitating major financial transactions, those financial transactions, particularly in the era of high-speed trading, need to be timestamped, because if you have an order to buy or an order to sell that goes to a broker, you want to make sure if you get your order in before someone else sells, right, that they don't drive the price down, and then through a manipulation of the timestamps, you end up losing a great deal of money. So it's very important to attach to the transaction the time that the broker received that transaction. And the interesting thing about a company that was called DigiStamp, is now called eStamp, in Chicago, means that Swigert would have been in contact or communication with these people and effectively forming a partnership with a company that could timestamp crime scenes. I mean, let's say hypothetically, you've got a global network of operated by Serco's shareholders of patent for rent, murder for hire, right? Using domestic or foreign commerce, right, to move the money around or the credits around by which you pay the hit team. So what I think these people have done, is rather clever, is they've decided that moving money around can be easily traced. Why don't they invent the myth of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, where they say people, particularly you, Jason, and myself, the carbon dioxide we breathe out risks the Earth going into a cycle of catastrophic anthropogenic the concentration of carbon dioxide as you and I do, which is 40,000 parts per million. So if you take a scientifically illiterate, which I would include most lawyers, including Cass Sunstein and Barack uh, and Michelle Obama being an intellectual property lawyer, and Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn, and Bill and Hillary Clinton. They are all, now, nothing against lawyers, except, you want to make sure they're deeply buried, right? Anyway, I'm being facetious about the profession of law. I happen to be an engineer, I think a reasonably capable one, with a background of artificial intelligence going back to 1981. And I can make a reasoned, I think, deductive argument based on the laws of science, conservation of energy, matter, space, and time, zeroth first and second law of thermodynamics. But if I asked Bill Clinton what the second law of thermodynamics meant to him, I think he wouldn't have a clue, which is very important. So you've got these lawyers grouped in that the evil teachers tunnel, and they don't understand the basic laws of physics, which, for example, would suggest that you can't take a Boeing civilian aircraft and fly it through 8 walls of the Pentagon, create a hole on the inside of 12 foot in diameter. So all of this hand waving and gesturing and political correctness of the lawyer, nothing until you put it in the hands of a skilled propagandist like Cass Sunstein. So if you could just zoom in on Mr. Sunstein or Professor Sunstein, this is a very important character, because going back to the 3-tunnel metaphor, if you can take the timestamp data from a crime scene and give it to people engaged in what is known as death pool betting, where they're betting on the time of death and the body count of the victims, particularly associated with the weight of carbon saved by killing a whole bunch of people in the North and South Towers, you give them an advantage over the police who are investigating the crime, because you deprive the police, the FBI, let's say, or their equivalent in the UK or the Five Eyes countries, with the timestamp data that would allow them to reconstruct the sequence of events that led up to the crime. So the FBI is now unable to solve any of these significant crimes where timestamp data, has been stripped from the crime. And so now I'm looking at, let's say, Bishop Gators, who goes into that restaurant and apparently is poisoned. There's a rat feces and thallium and arsenic showing up in his bloodstream. Thallium is a very, very toxic substance that was used in rat poison, but I believe it's been banned in the Five Eyes countries. But I believe China still uses it to control rats. And you've got that marvelous rat in front of Bishop Gators. That is, I think it's a heavy metal rat, isn't it?
Exactly.
I mean, you designed
that's the idea, heavy metal rat. Now, David, we've also introduced for the first time in the collage Seth Rich. And obviously the Seth Rich story is one that viewers of Crowdsource the Truth have followed closely. It's another case where key evidence has gone missing, chain of custody broken. His laptop, according to Rod Wheeler, who I've interviewed a few times, the FBI said the Washington, D.C. Metro Police had it, and the Washington, D.C. Metro Police said the FBI had it. So somebody has done something with that laptop that seems to be preventing the investigation of the murder. And I think most people who are familiar with that story were pretty dissatisfied, including his family, with the police work involving that murder. The police declared it simply a botched robbery, although there's no indication that any sort of robbery went on. He had all his stuff with him, and he was simply shot. He's been associated with the leak of DNC information, potentially John Podesta's email information. He's been associated with Julian Assange of WikiLeaks. Why did we choose to include Seth Rich in the collage this week?
Well, I think, as you point out, there's obviously a break in the chain of custody of the evidence. So now, would that be a suitable role for an ethical hacker to break into the chain of custody of data and evidence from a crime scene, either wittingly or unwittingly, or willingly or unwillingly, take the timestamp data that would allow the police to reconstruct the events leading up to the shooting of Seth Rich, and give that to a privileged group of, let's say, teachers, such that they can, so to speak, arrange a contract hit, right? But exist off the map of the investigative police, so they're still out there free. Remember, what was it? Bill Ayers said, "Guilty as hell, free as a bird."
Yeah.
And Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn basically were on the run in the 1970s, right? Then they pick up this career at the universities. And I'm saying to these universities, well, you've got on your faculty unindicted psychopaths,
Yeah.
right? Who are not stupid or not dumb. So when I see the emergence of this evil Batcave network with its time-stamping capabilities in Chicago, BAT stands for Bright Advanced Technology. CAVE stands for Cave Advanced, Cave Automatic Virtual Environment.
Yeah.
You literally have a command center for the teachers with time stamping that would allow them to, well, let's say, in the words of Dr. Thomas Barnett, watch the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history through the networks attached to the Electronic Visualization Laboratory in Chicago, which hooks up to Northwestern University's IT partnerships,
Right.
which hooks through to the BBC. Meaning the BBC, in my book, could quite possibly have access to NPL, that's National Physical Laboratory timestamping, to synchronize the images that it puts out to the public on 911, which include the images of Jane Stanley in New York announcing that Salomon Smith Barney building had come down in New York, even though it's still showing behind her left shoulder. Right? Now, what that means is the people who put the script together, right, got out of sync with the demolition team who went in to building number 7 and demolished it because it would have contained all of the evidence of the type, time-stamped evidence, of major frauds on the stock market, as followed by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which lost all its records. And Mr. Ross, Wilbur Ross, as I believe the head of the financial intelligence network used by Osama bin Laden to move his assets around the world, ought to know about it. And if he doesn't know about it, he's well past his sell-by date. You know, I just look at his expression when you were putting those questions to him. And he said, I didn't come here to talk about Serco. Well, why not? Because Serco has processed the 4 millionth patent of the last 10 million patents for the United States Patent Office. And Serco has amongst its shareholders the two big teachers' pension fund, TIAA in the United States, Teachers Insurance Annuity Association, the world's biggest private pension fund, over $1 trillion of assets under management, and the Universities Superannuation Scheme in the UK, which now controls the National Physical Laboratory and NPL Time. Over to you.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, David, is NPL Time. I think we should talk a bit more about this. It strikes me as one of those things that the average person doesn't think about. Now, in my career in dealing with visual effects and digital editing, time code is always critical. And when you have mismatches in time code, there are all kinds of details, different formats and drop frame time code, frame rates. When these time codes get sort of off, it can introduce all kinds of problems. So there's aspects to these things that the average person maybe doesn't think about, but as you're pointing out, when you're conducting some sort of big military operation, particularly when it takes place on an international scale where you've got different people in different time zones, you know, people flying in AWACS, people in ground stations, people in Europe, AFRICOM, United States, etc. This distribution of timing signals becomes critically important, and doing it accurately is a major thing. So the NPL is the National Physical Laboratory, and we've got this webpage here about NPL Time. It describes it as a resilient, traceable, and certified time distribution service for the financial sector. Now, the concept that I think we're most interested in is if someone could hack this sort of a thing and manipulate these, heavily certified and authenticated services, well, you could go a long way toward fooling people if you had control of something that everyone trusted.
Yeah, totally. And if you take the protocol of the Federal Bridge Certification Authority, X509, note that, Mr. Swigart, we can read, the blurb about it without necessarily understanding the details. This was introduced in 1988. Federal Bridge Certification Authority, or Public Key Infrastructure, was invented at GCHQ together with packet switching and the precision clock. So the foundation mens rea, if you will, and there are many, I'm absolutely convinced, honorable scientists at the National Physical Laboratory doing their particular thing, but scientists have a very blinkered vision. If I'm working on a cesium fountain clock, I'm not working on solving the crime associated with putting poison in Bishop Gator's food in a Spanish restaurant in Queens. So unfortunately, you have these blinkers. So people, in many cases, may not be aware that the technology they've developed gives the protecting into sovereign scale communications network. So let's just take the attack on the North Tower. On the 47th floor of the North Tower, there was a meeting of Serco shareholders, right? 3 governments, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, and the United Kingdom, 2 big pension funds, TIAA and the University Superannuation Scheme of the UK, probably $1.4 trillion of assets under management, the state of California, and 10 banks or global custodians that would be very familiar to NM Rothschild, those global custodians, including BNY Mellon, with over $100 trillion of assets under management. So when that attack took place on the North Tower, I'm going to make a statement now that I think might repay some serious visiting by the FBI and the equivalent police in other countries. I believe that meeting of the Serco shareholders on the 47th of the floor of the North Tower was using NPL time, whereas the firefighters, the New York Authority, Port Authority, New York and New Jersey Port Authority police, of which I think 60 died on 9/11, and the poor peasants in the towers, including 684 or 685 employees of Cantor Fitzgerald who died. I think many of them would have been on their wristwatches if they carried that. There would have been a clock on the wall. All right. What they wouldn't have had is access to milli or microsecond accuracy of the red attack team that was able to convert a continuity of government exercise right across North America into a live fire attack, which I believe was an attempt to overthrow the government of the United States by force. Over to you.
Yeah. So it's interesting for people to hear about some of these new companies' NPL time and time distribution methods. Now, David, what else? There were a number of other things that you had brought up. So e-time stamp, how does that fit in with NPL time?
Well, I think they've been synchronized. So eStamp in Chicago, which would obviously have connections to the big banks, Chicago Mercantile Exchange, all of those transactions where you're time stamping a broker's order, buy or sell order, et cetera, will be synchronized with National Physical Laboratory time. So there'll be basically an opportunity for, well, let's call it what I think is an appropriate, a RICO, a racketeering, influenced and corrupt organization engaged in murder for hire using patents for rent with fiber optic links right around the world connecting campuses. Now, let's say you have a university campus, which is University of Northwestern University, University of Illinois, Chicago, University of Chicago, a whole set of universities in Chicago. Mm-hmm. I believe they cabled the World Trade Center buildings 1, 2, and 7 with fiber optic links, laid across that pedestrian tunnel between the Winter Gardens and the World Trade Center.
Right.
And what the fiber optic allows you to do, it's almost impervious to electromagnetic crosstalk. So if you have highly energetic explosives or incendiaries in of copper, great danger is you induce a current, a detonation or an ignition current into that cable, and you blow yourself up. Well, these cowards, they certainly don't want to do that. They want to kill, you know, uniformed firefighters and police and alleged, the fat cats of Wall Street, leaving themselves unscathed. But just remember the TAT8, transatlantic telephone cable number 8, was the first fiber optic link laid between the United Kingdom and the United States and France by British Telecom, France Telecom, and AT&T. And that was financed by Rothschild, and Rothschild.
Wow.
So you've actually got the potential to put fiber optic links into the World Trade Center, run the fiber optic to different floors, hooked it up to igniters for incendiary devices. They didn't use many explosives because it would have made too big a seismic signature. And basically, one of the leader of the Signals Intelligence Network is, I believe, Maureen Baginski, working at that time with the NSA. In 2003, she jumped ship from the NSA and joins the FBI, and she develops the FBI's first intelligence network. Now, I don't know if people can persuade me that the FBI didn't have an intelligence network before. However, what I think they had was a GPS timed network. So what she introduced, this would be an allegation, she introduced a network into the FBI that ran on NPL time, which allowed certain insiders of the FBI to sabotage these crime scene investigations. And some of the insiders of the FBI at the time would include Robert Mueller.
Right.
Now, Robert Mueller should have sent a team from the FBI to Porton Down in the United Kingdom near Salisbury to determine whether or not the Ames bacteria, weaponized with sabotage spore powder, was smuggled out of Porton Down Research Center into biowarfare via, let's say, Boscombe Down, which is the airport run by Kinetic for the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense. And Kinetic in North America has a patent called Social Engineering Protection Appliance. And I'm not saying I'm going to warfare, but what I've noticed with our websites, the Patreon website,
Yeah.
I think someone is frightening or persuading our potential subscribers, and I believe we're doing the most important work to solve these crimes of any organization in the world, to lay off us or support for us, because my subscribers, for which I'm very, very grateful, have, at the end of each month, they drop off. But there was a time when we were expanding at a tremendous rate, which I think reflects the important work that you and I collectively are doing. Over to you.
Yeah, David, it's strange. I've noticed that as well. Every new month, there are a number of Patreon sponsors who drop off. I guess it's just the normal flow of people who decide they don't want to watch anymore. But every Friday, people can watch David Hawkins' Reverse CSI. That's on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. People can also see it on subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. And it's really important that people sponsor the show, sponsor Crowdsource the Truth, and David. People can also go to David's exciting new webpage, Reverse CSI Scripts. That's totally free, and you're going to get a lot of interesting information on there, including the video playlist of the shows that David and I do on YouTube. For access to the exclusive content, please become a sponsor on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. You can also follow David on Twitter. He's there at CSI Hawkins, and David is doing daily blog posts and tweeting about those blog posts. So some of the concepts we've introduced today are kind of new, David. NPL time, the time stamping, etc. We've got just a few minutes left. It feels like the hour has flown by, and there's so much for us to discuss. Do you want to cover anything? We haven't even mentioned ADX Florence.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely, because I've been struggling how to communicate with my Patreon side exactly what we're doing. Sometimes I wonder if I understand what I'm doing, right? So I talk about these storyboards, and I think you pointed out that the term storyboards is not quite what is meant by the film industry, etc. But it's an important for me to establish that. And as you and I have been working together, I realized that you and I think quite possibly Larry Gators, who managed to survive the poisoning, up against a formidable enemy in terms of its financial and signals intelligence network. That is to say, they have, I would say, access to well over $100 trillion of assets under management, including major shareholdings in Boeing, where they can control the directors. You and I have access to really limited funds, but it's important when people make a contribution. So I thought, I woke up this morning, and you and I had been discussing what the title was. And I woke up this morning with a brainwave, at least I think it's useful. The term used by the National Physical Laboratory and the people in the UK responsible, I believe, for the 9/11 attack is time over fiber.
Right.
And I substituted for time teachers over fiber,
I
because what
had to
I think
change
they've
that
done.
though, David. It didn't
Yes,
fit.
I know you did. And I reversed it for my
Sorry.
Patreon. No, I understand that. But that's it. That's important, because if I say to people, okay, we've got a time over fiber network, well, that requires a long technical discussion. But if we say that Serco is operating a teachers over fiber network, I think it's more easily understood, because what Serco has amongst its shareholders are these two ginormous pension funds with $1.5 trillion of assets under management. So why wouldn't Serco provide the teachers with fiber networks that gives them real-time connection between the electronic visualization laboratory in Chicago and crime scenes such as the mosque shooting in Christchurch or the Easter Sunday um, bombing in Sri Lanka, where the evil teachers, it's their acronym, not mine, right, get the opportunity to take the data necessary to solve the crime, split it into three tunnels. One carries the timestamps necessary for a Deadpool conspiracy, where you pay the killers a share of the weight of carbon saved in a mass casualty event under this hoax of climate change. You provide the police with just enough data for them to think that they can do something useful. But if you strip the timestamp from the data given to the FBI, they can't solve the crime, because they can't reconstruct the crime scene with the causes that precede the events. And then the balance of the data you can feed to the social engineers. I don't say they report directly to Cass Sunstein, but Cass Sunstein has laid out a legalistic argument as to how a government can protect itself against conspiracy theories by subverting what they allege to be the conspirators, which obviously precludes. I mean, the first time I heard that, I bristled, because, I'm an engineer and I have a background with explosives and radioactive materials, and I've helped put out oil fires around the world, etc., etc. So I think I'm a technically sophisticated individual who can reason from cause to effect. And then when I was told that I was a conspiracy theorist, I bristled.
Right.
This is the most Orwellian term you can imagine, because you can't get past first base when there are all these questions of fact that need to be asked before you can determine who's behind it. So Cass Sunstein, Maureen Baginski, and Wilbur Ross are extremely dangerous individuals. I think they control or directly influence the human intelligence network, the financial intelligence network, and the signals intelligence network used by Osama bin Laden's Al Qaeda group and subsequently ISIS to visit these high value target mass casualty events around the world, while keeping we the people in subjection. So I'm suggesting that what we potentially can do is, instead of teacher over fiber networks, I want to see students over fiber networks. So every student, sophomore or up, can go into a university like Northwestern University and say to the administrators of Northwestern University, "What the hell are you doing with Bernadine Dawn on faculty? What damage has she done with her lectures on torture paradigms and practice?" I mean, these people should be in jail, quite possibly on death row. Over to you.
I agree with you, David. I think we're out of time for today, but you've introduced a lot of new topics. It sometimes takes me a couple times of hearing about them to really make the connections. But what I'm finding is the more we discuss, the more we uncover, the more these connections seem so coincidental that they need further explanation. We've still got an open invitation to Christine Marcy to join us on the show and talk about what we may have wrong. We've spoken to Maxine Brown, we've spoken to a variety of different people, and there's so much for us to still figure out. But David, I want to thank you for joining me today. People can join us on Friday. We'll be back at 1 p.m. Eastern. And if people are not currently sponsors of David or of Crowdsource the Truth, I hope they will go to patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth or subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. We can't do these shows without your sponsorship, and we appreciate everyone who is watching and sponsoring the show. If you can't sponsor for $2 a month, $1 a month, whatever the amount might be, please like the video, share the video, send it around to friends of yours who might be interested in learning about everything from the Weather Underground to the Down Low Club. We're going to be arranging an interview with Bishop Larry Gators to talk about this horrendous poisoning that he suffered, and people can learn more from Bishop Gators about the Down Low Club and some of the really risky investigations that he's been doing and how he's been speaking out about this really secretive society. It's interesting, David, because that Down Low Club, you know, it involves doing weird sexual stuff. That is to say, people who you might not think would be involved in that. And it seems to match the pattern of these secret societies that want to get people into things that they would be embarrassed to reveal so that there's a degree of control over them.
Yeah, absolutely, Jason. And I got a rush, but anyway, I'm looking forward to the next show, and see you later, eh?
Wonderful. We'll see you Friday, David. Thanks for joining me, and thanks everybody for watching. I'll see everyone tomorrow.